Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. I want to talk to you about something within the libertarian movement today that might not appear to be a burning issue of the day, but it really is. I mean, I want to talk to you about the methodology of advancing liberty, or more simply, how do we achieve the free society as libertarians? And the reason it's a burning issue of the day is because things are really bad off in this country, as everyone knows. You've got out of control spending, out of control debt, government's out of control. You got a government that's with the power to assassinate Americans and torture them and round them up, and is over there killing people in the Middle East practically on a daily basis. Everywhere you look, there's a crisis: Social Security crisis, healthcare crisis, immigration crisis, Iraq crisis, ISIS crisis. I mean, there's crises everywhere, and there's a common denominator to all these crises, and that's the federal government, or specifically the welfare warfare state. And things are only getting worse. And it's always possible that you can have just a perfect storm where you have an economic crisis, a monetary crisis, a foreign policy crisis, where it all comes together, where people are getting plundered and looted of their money to finance some new adventure or escapade, and with at the same time capital controls and monetary controls and increased taxes. And so the time for talking about achieving freedom is right now, and nothing could be more burning than how do we achieve the free society. Now, when I founded the Future of Freedom Foundation some 25 years ago, I made it our mission to present an uncompromising case for libertarianism. Why did I do that? Well, because I believed that this was the way to achieve the free society, that is through principles that we achieve our goal. Now, what's our goal? Well, as libertarians, we have one goal, and that's the free society. We are all striving to achieve freedom. I mean, that's what libertarianism is all about. When you distill it down to its essence, we want to be free. And we know, unlike so many of our American counterparts, that we're not living in a free society. In fact, I often say that the best way to capture the plight of our fellow Americans is through the words of Johann Goethe, who said, "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free." And so what does that mean to us as libertarians? What is freedom? Well, that's a vitally important question, because if you have a sort of a distorted or wrong view of freedom, like people on the left do, or even conservatives do too. I mean, they think that freedom involves the welfare warfare state, that they're free when they live in this kind of way of life. And so it's extremely important that we come up with an understanding of what a free society really is. And I think that a good benchmark is say 1890 America. Now, I'm not suggesting that this was a perfectly pure libertarian society. We all know it wasn't. I mean, women didn't have the right to vote. 40 years before that, you had slavery, and you have in 1890 corporatism, crony capitalism, where partnerships between business and government. You've got land grants to the railroads, regulations at the local level. So it wasn't a pure libertarian society, but I think we can look at that as a minimal benchmark to what a free society really is. And we need that benchmark to then measure how it is that we're going to achieve this freedom. If we can't define what freedom is, then it becomes just a mishmash of, hey, let's do this and let's do that. And so to me, here is a minimal benchmark. Now, what is that benchmark? Okay, here was a society with no income tax, no IRS, no Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, no immigration controls, no foreign aid, no giant military industrial complex, no military empire, no standing army. They had a very basic minimal military force. No torture, no assassinations, no NSA, no CIA, very few economic regulations, and no public schooling to speak of. I think Massachusetts had mandatory attendance laws, but nobody else did. So you didn't have the public schooling systems, or certainly no federal government involvement in education, no drug laws. So here was the most unusual society in history, and yet it produced tremendously positive results. You've got people going from rags to riches in 1, 2, or 3 generations. You had thousands of penniless immigrants flooding into American shores, not with the idea of, hey, we're coming to get on welfare, because there was no welfare for anyone. The idea was, hey, we have a chance to become wealthy. We have a chance to become prosperous by entering the marketplace and working hard and serving consumers. And the poor were getting wealthy. And so you not only had this huge, enormous positive economic consequence where standards of living were soaring with each generation through savings and capital and productivity, but you also had this tremendous outburst of voluntary charity. I mean, when the government was prohibited from getting into the charity business, this is how the hospitals were getting built, the universities, the museums, the opera houses, the poor kitchens, that people with wealth were funding these things. And even, of course, many of the middle class and the poor were funding these things, all on a voluntary basis. Okay, so there's my minimal benchmark. Now, I'm not suggesting it's the ideal. My ideal, for example, would be a constitutional amendment that tracks like the First Amendment, which has been pretty effective. I mean, we don't have the government building churches or subsidizing churches or mandating that people go to church. Yeah, there's a tax on the margin where people are advocating prayer for people that are mandated to attend public schools. But by and large, the First Amendment has served as pretty much a barrier to government getting involved in religion. I'd like to see the same thing for commerce. No law shall be enacted respecting the regulation of commerce or abridging the free exercise thereof. And you do the same with ingesting substances, with income taxes and so forth. You abolish these things, not just through repeal, but through constitutional amendment, which makes it much more difficult to bring them back into existence. But here's your minimal benchmark. Now, why is that important? Well, because today in the libertarian movement, you had, and this has really been going on for 25 years that I've been doing it, you've got some people advocating reform programs of the welfare warfare state. And then you've got those of us that are saying, we're not interested in reform. We're interested in freedom. And that freedom is a dismantling of these programs, not a reform of the programs. Now, you might ask me, well, Jacob, would you oppose a reform that improves the system? Of course I wouldn't. If a reform is going to improve the plight of the serfs here under the welfare warfare state, great. Somebody comes to me and says, hey, Jacob, we're going to cut income taxes by 50%. Fantastic. As long as you cut spending too, because as you know, the real level of taxation is how much you're spending. And because they're going to get the money from someplace. So you're going to cut spending 30%, cut income taxes 30%. Great. But there's something important to recognize about this. And that is that isn't freedom. It's a better way of life under a serfdom way of serfdom society, but it's not freedom. And that's what we libertarians are about. Again, we're about freedom. We want to achieve the free society. What is that free society? That's that benchmark. No income taxes, no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no warfare state. Because, people often say to me, hey, Jacob, libertarian's fine, but it's pie in the sky, it's utopian, unachievable. Really, that's not true. 1890, if you look at 1890, they proved, those Americans, that this is an achievable paradigm. Not perfect, but that's a minimal benchmark as to what a free society is. And so if you're going to talk to me about reforming Social Security or reforming Medicare, reforming Obamacare, you might be able to come up with a better reform, a better way of life under this serfdom society, but it's not freedom. And the analogy on this is that if we go back to, let's say, earlier in the 19th century, let's say 1850, I mean, today, I think most everyone, I'd say 99% of Americans, especially libertarians, oppose the concept of slavery. I mean, it's difficult to find anybody out there saying, let's bring slavery back, and rightfully so. I mean, from a moral standpoint, it is just an abhorrent violation of the principles of freedom. But I recently read an article in the New York Times that said that in the in that period of time before the Civil War, like in the 1850s or so, that being an abolitionist, that is a person that called for the abolition of slavery, was not a popular thing. And I'm sure it certainly wasn't a popular thing in the South. And so, that would take courage to stand up there and say, we need to abolish slavery. In fact, the article said that the magazine called the Liberator, which was the premier abolitionist magazine, had it at its peak, about 3,000 subscribers out of a much larger population at that time. And yet they were very, very influential. Why? Because they took the principled approach. Now, if somebody had come, let's say we're living back in the 1850s, and somebody comes to us and says, hey, will you guys get involved in the reform movement? And we say, well, what's the reform movement? Well, we're going to better the lives of the slaves on the plantations, and we're going to get some legislation enacted where it mandates an 8-hour day for slaves, maximum 8 hours of work, prohibits lashing, gives them better health care, and lets them keep their families together, and that this would be the law. Okay, you ask me, is this something good? Absolutely. I'm not going to argue with that. But it's not just something that I would get really excited about personally. Why? Well, because I want freedom for the slaves. I don't want to spend my life trying to get them a better way of life on the plantation. That just doesn't appeal to me. I want to spend my life getting freedom for them. And I have a hunch that if you were to do a survey of slaves and you ask them, which would you prefer, a better way of life on the plantation or freedom? My hunch is that 99%, if not more of them, would say, we'll take freedom. And so that's what would matter to me. I would say, hey, let's put together some efforts here to get this system dismantled. Now, clearly, the arguments for reforming slavery, improving it, are totally different from the arguments that are why slavery should be abolished. Because when you've got the reform, everything's going to revolve around, well, 8 hours a day. No, how about 10 hours? Yeah, and the whole debate revolves around whether it should be 8 or 10 hours, or lashing. Well, sometimes lashing's important, and let's have an emergency exception. If the slave escapes, then lashes are going to be permitted in that sense, but can't be used on a daily basis. And so everything revolves around whether the life of the slave should be improved or not, and whether this method will improve the life of the slave. And that just doesn't hold any appeal for me. Now, notice the argumentation on the illegitimacy of the apparatus itself, slavery. I mean, you talk about that people have a fundamental right to live their lives any way they want, that no person has the moral right to enslave another person. And so you start talking in terms of moral principles. I mean, you can also throw in some economics if you want about a free society. People are more efficient. They produce better than slaves do. But to me, what really matters is that moral argument, that this is just wrong. And if somebody were to come along to me and say, well, Jacob, let's just gradually get rid of slavery, I would say, well, that may end up happening as a practical matter, but we have to take the moral position that slavery has to end today because it's wrong. Otherwise, to countenance slavery, even for a short period of time during the period that is gradually being reduced, you end up weakening your argument. And the person that was a big influence on me in this area was Leonard Read, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education. And he wrote essays talking about this, that when you have this gradualist approach to freedom, that you end up losing the power of that moral argument. And in large part because you're implicitly condoning or countenancing the wrongdoing for a certain period of time. That is, if you're willing to countenance slavery for, a year while it's gradually being reduced, then people say, well, maybe it's not that bad. I mean, it loses the force of the argument as compared to you saying it has to be ended today. Even though it might not be ended today, that's the power of the argument. All right, so when you apply that to the welfare warfare state, it seems to me that the same thing applies. That now obviously reforms come in different forms and degrees. You've got reform programs that just purport to reform a status program, make it better. You've got programs that purport to gradually reduce the role of the state in our economic affairs. And so you've got these variations. but none of them excite me very much. I mean, if you take some, for example, the reforms on public schooling, like vouchers. Well, vouchers has elements of both, because in the early days, voucher proponents used to argue that they were a gradual way to get rid of the state in education. But the way I look at it is that when you've got this reform plan, you lose the power of the moral argument, and that is that the state has no legitimate role in education, and you end up revolving your arguments about whether the reform is good or not. Are vouchers good? Do they provide a better education for people? Do they improve the educational system? And very rarely do you have voucher proponents saying this is a way to get rid of public schooling, because they're afraid of losing votes or support. Now, an exception to this was Milton Friedman, who is, if not the originator of the idea of vouchers, certainly the greatest promoter of them. And ironically, it's kind of an interesting story that in our first year of operation at FFF, I wrote an essay, criticizing this notion of reform and gradualism, and arguing for this principled approach to liberty. And I used vouchers as an example, and I said this is just a socialist device, and it takes money from one group of people and gives it to another group of people through the force of the political process. So its foundation is no different from public schooling, which is clearly a socialist structure. So you've got this mandated coercive redistribution of wealth. Well, lo and behold, Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate, writes a critique of my piece, or he actually gave it in a speech, and then it was reduced to writing and published in Liberty magazine. You can find it online today, where he talks about Future of Freedom Foundation. He says, hey, this is a group that's doing good work, but here Jacob Hornberger writes this article criticizing vouchers. And he says, but why aren't vouchers a legitimate way to get from here to there? And to there, he meant a separation of school and state, which he acknowledged was legitimate freedom. And so, okay, I can tip my hat to that. At least he's saying that this is a way to get from A to B. My argument is that that's not likely to happen. In fact, it's a virtual certainty it's not going to happen. But even if it did, you lose the force of the argument, though, when you're saying, I'm willing to countenance it for a certain period of time. I'm willing to countenance the plunder and the looting. Then somebody's going to sit there and say, well, gosh, it can't be that bad if you're saying it's okay for a certain period of time. Again, the power of the argument on education is that the government has no role in education. People should be free to manage the educational decisions of their own families. They should be sovereign over these decisions. The free market should be there to let entrepreneurs provide educational devices and services to consumers. But it's a moral argument, and that it should be done today, even though you know that it's not going to happen today as a practical method. It causes people to question the apparatus itself, rather than to debate the reform. Because all too often the reform, since it hardly ever discusses the legitimacy of the overall apparatus, it ends up just fortifying in people's minds that there's nothing wrong with the state being involved in education, or being involved in the economy, or being involved in so many other areas of our lives. That the only way you can get people to question the apparatus is to question the apparatus. Now, that doesn't mean that there's a guarantee that people are going to buy the argument. They might not. But if you don't ever raise the argument, it's pretty much guaranteed that people are never going to think about it. So the only chance there is to get America out of this morass, this constant crisis, is to cause people to think in much higher terms than just reforming the welfare state. You have to get them to think in terms of questioning the apparatus, the welfare state apparatus, the drug war apparatus, the warfare state apparatus. And because if they don't question that, then all of a sudden we're just mired down in essentially slaves on the plantation, arguing over reforms and improvements to the system, instead of the moral argument of freedom, which is what we're all about. And again, we can go back to this benchmark of 1890. Here's your benchmark. And so they didn't have Social Security. So, and that's not utopian, that's a practical thing. They didn't have it. They proved that you can have a society for more than 100 years without a Federal Reserve System, without an IRS. Okay, so then why not go for that as the goal? Because now there's another aspect to this idea of the gradualist methods. You know, I just naturally assumed, like Friedman and everyone else when I got into the libertarian movement, that what were called gradualist methods to achieve freedom really were gradualist methods. I'm questioning that now. I've come to the conclusion that all too often they're not gradualist methods at all. They're just another statist program, and they're couched in terms of choice or privatization or free market, but really they fortify the role of the state even more. I mean, you can see this with respect to like the Social Security plans, where people are forced to put their money in to a system where there's an array of government-approved investment devices, and they get to choose between those devices, so it's called choice. But it's all based on coercion and mandates, and it's an interventionist system. Now, is interventionism better than socialism, like the system we have today, where the money is taken from young people and people in their middle age and given to seniors? It's possible that. Of course, the socialists wouldn't say so. They would say, hey, the stock market could crash and everybody loses their retirement money, you know, like it did in 1929, and therefore a socialist system is better because you can count on young people and people in you know, their 20s and 30s and 40s producing money that'll fund the seniors. But you know, I have absolutely no interest as a libertarian to get into a debate over whether interventionism is better than socialism or vice versa. What I try to keep focused on, and try to keep the focus of the Future of Freedom Foundation on, is the goal line. We want a free society. And okay, what's that benchmark again? That benchmark is no Social Security at all, no mandates, where people are free to keep everything they earn. And that's the force of that moral argument, that separation of economy and the state, the moral right of people to keep everything they earn and decide what to do with it, even if they decide not to donate to charity or donate to their church or help their mother and father when they get sick and elderly and so forth. That's the essence of freedom. And so that obviously raises the critically important question that I think we need to be asking ourselves in this movement, is what is the role of government in a free society? And I know that debate takes place in the movement, but we also have to cause that question to be asked among the American people. Because in order for people to question the apparatus, the legitimacy of the apparatus, they've got to ask that question to themselves. What is the role of government in a free society? Now we've all been growing up in this system where the role of government is a welfare state and a drug war and war on terrorism and foreign interventionism and bombing and killing and assassinating people overseas and the war on terrorism and all the NSA surveillance, that this is the role of government in a free society. We as libertarians know that's not true. That we may debate over what the basic role of government is in a society, but one thing that we're all clear on as libertarians is that the government has no legitimate role in the economy, in our pocketbooks, determining what we should do with our own money. It has no legitimate role in charity. It has no legitimate role in meddling in foreign affairs, interfering in the affairs of other countries, bombing, assassinations, torture, and so forth. So that's our minimal benchmark. And so when we're talking about methodology, we necessarily have to keep that goal line in mind. And that's where I think the area of principles comes in. I mean, this is a glorious movement. I mean, it's a beautiful movement. The philosophy of libertarianism, to me, it's like a Mozart symphony. There's a consistency to it. The principles are consistent. The application of the principles, and that when we start to compromise these principles with reforms and gradualism and so forth, we essentially dilute the purity of this vision that libertarianism brings to the world. Now, how do we achieve the free society? Well, that brings up what I call this my critical mass theory. I don't think it's necessary to go out and convert the world on libertarianism. And we all know that's not possible. I'm sure you guys have your experience with family members that you just can't convince to become libertarians. Okay, there's just certain people in life, maybe it's a DNA thing or something, that they just have to be status, and there's nothing's going to change that. I mean, you're not going to convince Barack Obama to become a libertarian. It's just not going to happen any more than you're going to convince the Joint Chiefs of Staff to become libertarians. But I'm suggesting that it's possible to achieve the free society without converting everybody. And this is my critical mass theory. I think that you can reach a free society by arriving at a critical mass of people that want that free society. And again, free society meaning like that minimal benchmark. No IRS, no income tax, no Social Security, none of the reforms or the programs that want genuine freedom as a minimal level compared to our benchmark. And I think it's possible. And I think we're getting close to that. I mean, this movement's been around a long time. And it shocked me when I saw what happened in Ron Paul's campaigns. I mean, where hundreds of thousands of people just pop up seemingly out of nowhere, supporting Ron, calling themselves libertarians. And, they may not be purist libertarians, but I mean, this was a phenomenal result. I mean, I was just stunned by it. I said, wow, where did all those people come from? Well, I have no doubts they came from people that have been working to promote liberty for the last 60 years. We work quietly. We've got our articles, ideas, seminars, conferences, discussion groups, just talking to friends and neighbors, and gradually we've built up this movement. And my hunch is that when you reach this critical mass, whatever that is, but I think it can clearly be less than a majority. I mean, you see this in companies, where companies are trying to shift their philosophy, and they just get like 5% or 10% of people that like the new philosophy, and all of a sudden everything shifts. Because the people in the middle, if you look at it as like a bell curve, you got over here the ones that want the free society, you got over here the status. The ones in the middle will just sort of shift. They don't care that much. They won't get involved that much. So it's really a battle between this group over here of freedom advocates and this group over here of the status. Well, if we can reach this critical mass, then we can bring about that shift. And I think we may be a lot closer than we think, and which means we've got to keep sticking with the principles, this minimal benchmark, and the attempt to reach this critical mass. And now, if you look at like 1890, this period where you had this minimal benchmark of freedom, imagine what the socialists and the interventionists must have been thinking. Like how do we get Americans to give up this fantastic way of life here, where no income tax, no IRS, no welfare state programs. And so they must have been a little bit despondent, but they were determined. And through the power of ideas and argumentation, and they just kept working the progressive movement through the late 1800s and then into the 1900s. And all of a sudden, in the 1930s, they brought the revolutionary shift toward the welfare state. And the warfare state they'd planted the seeds with the Spanish-American War and World War I, and then, of course, the giant national security state apparatus that totally transformed American life after World War II. But they were able to achieve this within, 40 years? I mean, and look at our movement. We've been advancing this libertarian philosophy for some 60 years or so. And so I think we may be a lot closer, which means we've got to just, fight that much harder. And how do we fight? Well, I suggest that we fight with these principles of what freedom is. And we keep trying to find the people that believe in principles, that want not just reform of the welfare state, any more than people who wanted reform of the slavery system, but find the people that want a dismantling of this system. Why? Because they want the free society. And that's what we've got to always keep in mind, that as we face these crises that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the crises all across the board, ISIS and Iraq and Afghanistan and Venezuela, and I mean, they just go on. And then over here on domestic side, the out of control spending, the debt, the debt ceiling, the monetary crisis, and whatever the crisis happens to be du jour, that what we libertarians are about is not a better way of life under these crises. We're about freedom. That's what our movement is. We are about the free society. That's what we're fighting for. And I think that if we do this, if we stick with these principles and we keep trying to build this critical mass of people that want the genuine free society, I think the world's going to stop dead in its tracks. And that we libertarians are going to not only lead America, to the highest reaches of freedom, building even much further than those people in 1890. I think we're going to end up leading the world to freedom. That's the show. That's the Libertarian Angle. And see you next week.